Ωραία. Μπορούμε να ξεκινήσουμε λοιπόν. Καλησπέρα σε όλες και όλους. Είμαι η Μαρία Καραμεσίνη, καθηγήτρια Οικονομικών στο τμήμα Κοινωνικής Πολιτικής και Πρόεδρος της Επιτροπής Ισότητας των Φύλων του Παντείου Πανεπιστημίου. Είναι η δεύτερη εκδήλωση που κάνουμε ως Επιτροπή Ισότητας με τη στήριξη των Πρυτανικών αρχών του Παντείου Πανεπιστημίου. Πέρσι τέτοιο καιρό, το θέμα της πρώτης μας εκδήλωσης μετά τη σύσταση της Επιτροπής μας ήταν ο σεξισμός, η έμφυλη βία και η σεξουαλική παρενόχληση. Με ερωτηματικό το πώς οργανωνόμαστε στο Πανεπιστήμιο. Στη σημερινή μας εκδήλωση, που την αποφασίσαμε πολύ πριν ξεσπάσει ο πόλεμος στην Ουκρανία, που έχει απορροφήσει την προσοχή και την αγωνία όλων μας, επιλέξαμε ως θέμα ένα εξαιρετικά σημαντικό και επίκαιρο θέμα, το οποίο αφορά την πρόταση για μια φεμινιστική οικονομία, μια μόβ οικονομία, που επεξεργαστήκανε μια ομάδα φεμινιστριών οικονομολόγων και στην οποία έπαιξε κορυφαίο ρόλο η σημερινή μας διακεκριμένη ομιλήτρια, Ipek Ilkkarakan, την οποία έχουμε την τιμή και τη χαρά να την έχουμε απόψε μαζί μας διαδικτυακά. Η Ipek είναι καθηγήτρια οικονομικών στο Τεχνικό Πανεπιστήμιο της Κωνσταντινούπολης και πρόεδρος της Διεθνούς Ένωσης για τα Φεμινιστικά Οικονομικά, συνεργαζόμενη ερευνήτρια του Levy Economics Institute στη Νέα Υόρκη και του Economic Research Forum στο Κάιρο και είναι αναπληρώτρια πρόεδρος της Συντακτικής Επιτροπής του ακαδημαϊκού περιοδικού Feminist Economics. Το 2018 έως το 2020 εργάστηκε στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Ρώμης Σαπιέντσα στην Ιταλία ως επισκέπτρια καθηγήτρια, ενώ οι τομείς έρευνας στις οποίους επικεντρώνεται το έργο της περιλαμβάνουν την οικονομία της φροντίδας, το φύλο και τη μακροοικονομία, την πολιτική οικονομία του φύλου, τις αγορές εργασίας και την ανάπτυξη. Το μοντέλο της για την μόβ οικονομία, το οποίο απεικονίζει ένα βιώσιμο οικονομικό σύστημα που στηρίζεται στην έμφυλη ισότητα, υιοθετήθηκε ως πρόταση από διάφορες γυναικείες οργανώσεις, συμπεριλαμβανόμενου του Ευρωπαϊκού Λόμπι Γυναικών με έδρα της Βρυξέλλες και του Διεθνούς Παρατηρητηρίου Γυναικείων Δικαιωμάτων Ασίας Ειρηνικού με έδρα τη Μαλαισία. Η Ipek Ilkkarakan έχει διατελέσει μέλος του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου της Διεθνούς Ένωσης για τα Φεμινιστικά Οικονομικά, του Middle Eastern Economics Association και είναι ιδρυτικό μέλος των Women for Women's Human Rights, New Ways Women's Labor and Employment Platform, του Κέντρου Γυναικείων Σπουδών του Τεχνικού Πανεπιστημίου της Κωνσταντινούπολης και του Ευρωπαϊκού Δικτύου της Διεθνούς Ομάδας Gender and Macroeconomics. Γιατί είναι σήμερα σημαντική η συζήτηση για μια μόβ οικονομία? Γιατί οι κοινωνίες στις οικονομικά αναπτυγμένες χώρες, μαζί τους και οι χώρες της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, αναζητούν ένα νέο αναπτυξιακό μοντέλο μετά από δύο πολύ σοβαρές δομικές, οικονομικές και κοινωνικές κρίσεις του νεοφιλελεύθερου μοντέλου παγκοσμιοποιημένου καπιταλισμού. Αναζητούν την υπέρβαση της κρίσης της πανδημίας, που συναρθρώνεται με την παγκόσμια κλιματική κρίση, καθώς και με την κρίση κοινωνικής αναπαραγωγής, την οποία προσθέτουν στην οικονομική και την οικολογική κρίση και την υπογραμμίζουν οι φεμινίστριες. Οι φεμινίστριες οικονομολόγοι δεν μπορούσαν να μην πάρουν μέρος σε όλη αυτή τη συζήτηση για την αναζήτηση ενός νέου αναπτυξιακού προτύπου, για τις αλλαγές δηλαδή που πρέπει να γίνουν στο αναπτυξιακό πρότυπο των οικονομιών και κοινωνιών, κυρίως στις χώρες του αναπτυγμένου κόσμου, αλλά όχι μόνο σε αυτές, προκειμένου να εντάξουν τη διάσταση του φύλου και το στόχο της ισότητας, της έμφυλης ισότητας, σε μια κοινωνικά προοδευτική κατεύθυνση εξόδου από την κρίση. Σταματάω εδώ, γιατί όλα αυτά θα μας τα αναλύσει με λεπτομέρεια η ομιλήτριά μας. Πριν δώσω το λόγο στην Ipek για τη διάλεξή της, θέλω να αναφέρω ότι η σημερινή εκδήλωση διεξάγεται με τη στήριξη των Πρυτανικών αρχών του Παντείου Πανεπιστημίου και καλώ την Πρύτανη του Πανεπιστημίου μας, Χριστίνα Κουλούρη, να κάνει τον εναρκτήριο χαιρετισμό. Κυρία Κουλούρη, έχετε το λόγο.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, αγαπητές και αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι. Αποτελεί εξαιρετική τιμή για το Πανεπιστήμιό μας να φιλοξενεί σήμερα μία διακεκριμένη επιστήμονα, μία ξεχωριστή προσωπικότητα, την Ipek Ilkkarakan, η οποία είναι γνωστή μέσα από το μοντέλο της φεμινιστικής, συμπεριληπτικής και βιώσιμης μόβ οικονομίας που έχει προτείνει και το οποίο, όπως αναλυτικά πριν παρουσίασε και η συνάδελφος η κυρία Καραμεσίνη, έχει ασκήσει μεγάλη επίδραση και στο φεμινιστικό κίνημα και στην οικονομική σκέψη. Βρισκόμαστε σε μια κρίσιμη ιστορική στιγμή που παρακολουθούμε το άθροισμα πολλαπλών κρίσεων που έχουν αθροιστεί και μέσα στο χρόνο, ξεκινώντας από μια μεγάλη και βαθιά οικονομική, πολιτική και κοινωνική κρίση που έπληξε τη χώρα μας, που ακολουθήθηκε από την οδυνηρή πανδημική κρίση σε παγκόσμιο επίπεδο, η οποία ακόμη συνεχίζεται, και αυτή η πρόσφατη κρίση μέσα στην οποία ζούμε, μία κρίση που σημαδεύεται από τον πόλεμο στην Ουκρανία και η οποία έχει συνέπειες που ακόμη δεν μπορούμε να προβλέψουμε. Σίγουρα όμως συνεπάγεται μία πολλαπλή ανθρωπιστική κρίση. Οι γυναίκες σε όλες αυτές τις κρίσεις ήταν ανάμεσα στα σημαντικότερα θύματα, όπως συμβαίνει άλλωστε με όλες τις λεγόμενες ευάλωτες κοινωνικές ομάδες. Οι γυναίκες, και θα μου επιτρέψετε εδώ να μιλήσω και με την ιδιότητα της ιστορικού, δεν είναι μόνο περιθωριοποιημένες και ευάλωτες, αλλά είναι και σιωπηλές. Είναι σε ό,τι αφορά τη γνώση του παρελθόντος, αλλά και στο παρόν, αυτό που θα λέγαμε οι σιωπηλοί οικιστές της ιστορίας, αυτών των οποίων η φωνή λιγότερο ακούγεται και για τις οποίες γνωρίζουμε τα λιγότερα. Αποτελεί μεγάλη κατάκτηση ότι στις τελευταίες δεκαετίες η φωνή των γυναικών ακούγεται όλο και πιο δυνατή, ενώ και εμείς που μελετάμε τους προηγούμενους αιώνες αναζητούμε να δώσουμε φωνή στις σιωπές. Θύμα όλων αυτών των κρίσεων βεβαίως είναι και τα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα και οι δημοκρατικοί θεσμοί, και αυτό στη χώρα μας το ζούμε κάθε μέρα και πιο έντονο. Έρευνες που έχουν γίνει σε ευρωπαϊκό επίπεδο μέσα στις χώρες της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης δείχνουν ότι το αποτέλεσμα της πανδημικής τουλάχιστον κρίσης είναι η αύξηση της ψυχικής και σωματικής βίας εναντίον των γυναικών και η αύξηση της οικονομικής εξάρτησης των γυναικών από τους άντρες. Και εδώ οι μισθοί των γυναικών ήταν αυτοί που επλήγησαν πρώτοι. Η ανεργία έπληξε κυρίως και πλήττει κυρίως τις γυναίκες, αλλά υπάρχουν και σοβαρές ψυχολογικές επιπτώσεις για γυναίκες, για παράδειγμα μητέρες που είχαν παιδιά μικρότερα των 15 ετών και τα οποία τα είχαν στο σπίτι όλο αυτό τον καιρό. Δεν υπάρχει αμφιβολία ότι οι γυναίκες έχουν καταφέρει πολλά μέσα από τους αγώνες τους, δεν τους χαρίστηκαν, τα διεκδίκησαν και τα κέρδισαν τα τελευταία 100 χρόνια, όπως είναι το δικαίωμα στην ψήφο, το δικαίωμα του εκλέγεσθε, το δικαίωμα στη μόρφωση και στην εργασία, η σεξουαλική απελευθέρωση. Όμως, είναι νομίζω θλιβερό να διαπιστώνουμε το 2022 ότι εξακολουθεί να υπάρχει μισθολογική ανισότητα μεταξύ ανδρών και γυναικών, ότι εξακολουθούν να υπάρχουν διακρίσεις σε ό,τι αφορά την επαγγελματική εξέλιξη και ότι ελάχιστες γυναίκες αυτή τη στιγμή κατέχουν θέσεις ευθύνης. Σε κάθε περίπτωση, το Παντείου Πανεπιστήμιο, ως ένα πανεπιστήμιο κοινωνικών και πολιτικών επιστημών, έχει θέσει ως μείζωνα στρατηγικό του στόχο την εμβάθυνση της έμφυλης ισότητας και την καταπολέμηση των κάθε μορφής διακρίσεων. σε αυτό το στόχο πολύτιμος αρρωγός είναι η Επιτροπή Ισότητας των Φύλων, που έχει δραστηριοποιηθεί την τελευταία χρονιά σε πολλά επίπεδα, αλλά με προσεκτικά βήματα, και οι συνάδελφοι που είναι εδώ, τις οποίες θέλω να ευχαριστήσω για όλο το χρόνο που έχουν επενδύσει και για όλη την προσπάθεια για να παραχθεί ένα έργο που πραγματικά θα ξεχωρίζει το Παντείου Πανεπιστήμιο στο πεδίο της καταπολέμησης των κάθε μορφής ανισοτήτων και βεβαίως της ανισότητας μεταξύ των φύλων. Δεν θέλω να μακρηγορήσω. Συγχαίρω λοιπόν για αυτή την πρωτοβουλία όλες τις συναδέλφους και την Πρόεδρο της Επιτροπής, την κυρία Καραμεσίνη, την Αντιπρύτανη Διεθνών Σχέσεων και Συνεργασιών, την κυρία Ψήλα, η οποία έχει και την αρμοδιότητα για θέματα ισότητας των φύλων, και χαιρετίζω λοιπόν αυτή την πρωτοβουλία για τη σημερινή εκδήλωση και καλωσορίζω, βεβαίως από μακριά, αλλά με την ελπίδα και από κοντά κάποια στιγμή, την ξεχωριστή συνάδελφο, την καθηγήτρια Ipek Ilkkarakan. Και σας ευχαριστώ και πάλι πολύ και θα παρακολουθήσω με μεγάλο ενδιαφέρον την ομιλία.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε την Πρύτανη κυρία Κουλούρη και για τις σκέψεις που μοιράστηκε μαζί μας και δίνω αμέσως το λόγο στην συναδέλφισσα Ipek Ilkkarakan. Ipek, έχεις το λόγο.
Hello, kalispera, good evening, everyone. I feel very honored to be giving this lecture at the University of Panteu, and I wish I could be there in person, and maybe someday we will get that chance once this pandemic is over. I thank Rector Kουλούρη and also the Gender Equality Committee of the University for this invitation, for giving me this chance. My colleague Maria Καραμεσίνη and we first met at a regional European initiative called the Gender Macroeconomics and International Economics Network meeting, which was held in Krakow. At the time, we were holding meetings in Istanbul and Krakow as the two polar ends of Europe to set up this feminist academic and activist network on feminist macroeconomics. And actually, the network was initiated by two dear colleagues, one Turkish, Nilüfer Çağatay, two feminist economists, Nilüfer Çağatay and Rania Antonopoulos, the other one, a Greek feminist economist. Both of them are valuable colleagues, and I'm very happy to be in continued networking with Karamesini and her colleagues in Greece. Okay, so I have a PowerPoint presentation, so let me share that. I hope you can see my screen. Yes? Okay. All right. So, as Maria said in her opening, actually what purple economy represents is it attempts to be a contribution to this search for a new development model, for a new economic order. And it, by giving an economic vision a color, it appeals to the widely used concept of the green economy, and it uses purple, the symbolic color of women's movements in some countries, including my own, Turkey, and from what I understand, also in Greece. And it is actually first originated at a meeting in 2009 organized by the German and the Turkish Greens in Istanbul, a green economy conference. And I was the last speaker of a long day of speakers to talk about gender equality and the green economy. So the issue was included in the conference, but as the very last address. And I came up on stage and I looked at an audience who had been tired from a whole day of listening and discussions. And I felt that I had to say something to wake them up. And this slogan came to my mind just off the spur of the moment. And I said, a green economy is not enough for a sustainable economy. We also need a purple economy. And that sort of woke people up. And I felt I was getting their attention. So that was in 2009. And then in 2013, I was invited under a German initiative supported by the Ministry of the Environment in Berlin to an expert roundtable on the green economy and the care economy. And that's when I was asked to actually take this beyond the slogan and develop it as an economic vision, as an economic model. So the two important characteristics of this vision is that it's gender egalitarian, but also it's caring. And the two are not necessarily synonymous, as I will explain in a little bit. And actually there can be trade-offs between the two. So the purple economy looks at achieving these both objectives simultaneously, a gender egalitarian economy and a caring economy. So the green economy concept originated about 20 years before the purple economy concept in 1989 by a British economist, David Pearce, who used it as a term to describe an ecological economic, healthy ecological economic vision in his report to the British government. And as we all know, the green economy actually suggests to internalize environmental costs into production and consumption patterns to ensure sustainability of natural resources and ecological balances. And through that, it aims to eliminate intergenerational and intersectional inequalities. The purple economy, in a similar vein, aims to internalize the cost of caring labor into production and consumption patterns to ensure the sustainability of care, of caring communities, caring economies. And through that, it hopes to eliminate gender-based inequalities, but also the intersectional inequalities that comes along with gender inequalities. So in a way, actually, there's a evolution of feminist terminology in this respect. It was back in the 18th, 19th century, initially through Marxist writings, when the term reproductive work, the reproductive sphere, reproductive labor came into usage. And there, in that Marxian model, the main focus, emphasis was on the macroeconomic function of care work for reproducing labor on an intergenerational basis, but also on a daily basis as a major input into the production process. And then this established a major departure point for feminist economists and feminist social scientists who developed further terminology on unpaid work, which puts the emphasis on the exploitative aspect of this phenomenon, domestic labor, household work, which puts the emphasis on its exclusion from the public and market sphere. And then through time, into the late 90s, into the 2000s, we had new terminology arising, care work, caring labor, which now puts the emphasis on the social and economic functions of this work for well-being of individuals, of families, of communities. And then arose the terminology care economy, which actually emphasizes how not only unpaid care work, but also paid care work all together, coming together, establish an entire economic subsystem with various economic and social functions. And purple economy, building up on these decades of feminist work, is actually a terminology that entails a vision of a call for a new economic order, as I just mentioned. Now, before I go on to explaining what it is, I would like to emphasize 3 points that this model actually underlines. So I already mentioned that the gender egalitarian economy and a caring economy can have some trade-offs. So we can look at various scenarios. One scenario is where an economy can be caring, but not gender egalitarian. And this is what we seem to be facing all over the world in most cases. So even when there's intervention with public policy, recognizing the importance of care work, these interventions reinforce gender norms through protecting women in their caretaking roles, such as legislating care leave exclusively for mothers, conducting cash for care, cash transfer policies, or enforcing flexible employment patterns and flexible employment policies, such as home-based work, teleworking, or part-time work that is consigned particularly to mothers or to women, in order to enable particularly women to reconcile their care work together with their unpaid care work, together with their paid work. An economy can also be gender egalitarian, but not caring, to the extent that women are incentivized to assume typically male economic behavioral patterns. So they are actually provided with the job opportunities and with particular subsidies for women's employment, but without public policy considering the fact that there's a huge amount of care work that goes on in the background. So with women taking up similar employment hours and similar commitments to the labor market as men currently do, that leaves hardly any time for caring for the others, for those who need it. So the purple economy warns against these two, what I call policy traps, these two trajectories of public policy, and encourages a third one, which is gender egalitarian and caring at the same time, where men are incentivized to assume typically female caretaking behavioral patterns. So rather than women being the sole focus on being incentivizing women to taking on employment and career commitments similar to men, men are incentivized to take similar, typically female commitments to caretaking. And here the public takes responsibility by provisioning care and regulating markets. So this is one point of emphasis of the purple economy. Another point of emphasis is that the model rests on two guiding principles, which entails simultaneously the perspectives of caregivers and care receivers. The first guiding principle is equality in caregiving through co-responsibility. This principle acknowledges the right to support in caregiving roles, the right to provide care for family and friends, and it calls for a reorganization of the care economy to promote co-responsibility between households, families on the one side, and the state on the other side, and co-responsibility between women and men within the sphere of the household. The second guiding principle is equality in care receiving, which reflects the perspectives of the care receivers. So it acknowledges the right to be cared for, particularly for those groups who are dependent on care, such as children, elderly, disabled, long-term ill, and sick people. And it acknowledges this right to be cared for with access to equal equal access to quality care options. The third emphasis point has to do with the complementarities between the purple economic objectives, the objectives of gender equality and caring economies, with other economic and social policy objectives such as jobs generation and unemployment reduction, poverty alleviation, eliminating inequalities by socioeconomic status, by other dimensions of origin, enhancing human capital and increasing productivity, and promoting sustainable, inclusive, and resilient economies. So this is an important emphasis point because as advocates for gender equality, it gives us the possibility of arguing with policymakers, particularly with macroeconomic policymakers, with economic and social policymakers, of the prioritization of investing in care, the prioritization of promoting purple economies along with green economies, because of all these multiplier effects of investing in care. So a series of recent applied empirical studies, most of them feminist empirical studies, show that investing in care services infrastructure, for instance, creates 2 to 3 times more jobs than investing in physical infrastructure. Despite that, whenever governments design a fiscal stimulus package, one of the first areas of spending they think of is physical infrastructure. So this feminist empirical work is questioning the budget allocation decisions of policymakers, of fiscal policymakers, and questioning why investing in social care infrastructure is not prioritized in fiscal policy, public spending, and fiscal stimulus packages. These applied studies also shows that investing in the care infrastructure enables superior outcomes in terms of reducing poverty through more jobs, which means 2 to 3 times more jobs, which means more labor income, but also through alleviating the restrictions on women's labor supply and promoting dual earner and dual carer families. So the studies, some of the other studies also shows that investing in care improves socioeconomic equality, particularly through investing in children's preschool education and early childhood development, and enhances productivity through this investing in children, and also through alleviating the time poverty of employed workers with care responsibilities. So there's a whole series of studies which originated actually back in 2008, 2010, with the work of Rania Antonopoulos and her co-authors at the Levy Economics Institute, and through the European Gender and Economics Network, we were inspired to undertake similar studies, first applied to Turkey, and then eventually ILO took an interest, the headquarters in Geneva, and they asked us to do an applied study on 45 countries. And now this applied policy simulation methodology has been turned into a guide, which is now in implementation over 30 countries. Okay, so the purple economy work revolves around 4 basic questions. Part of it is why a purple economic order, justifying care as a priority economic issue, which has been taken up by feminist economists. And the second part is how purple is necessarily complementary to green for a sustainable economy. And I will talk about how, in addition to an environmental crisis, there's also a care crisis, which Maria also mentioned in her opening talk as the social production crisis. And the third question is how to achieve the internalization of the cost of care. What would be the main policy intervention areas for a purple economic order. And then recently, with the pandemic, the urgency, why the urgency of a purple economic order for a resilient and gender equal recovery in the, I hope, post-COVID-19 era. In order to answer these questions, maybe it would be in order to look at, first of all, what we mean by the care economy. In a narrow sense, the care economy entails the production of goods and services necessary for physical, social, emotional well-being of children, elderly, ill, and disabled, these care-dependent groups, but also beyond that, it also entails the production of goods and services necessary for the care of healthy, prime working age adults, including self-care, in order to allow individuals and families and communities to function at a socially acceptable level of capability, comfort, and safety. There are two major components of this care economy. One entails household production, unpaid work and household production. Some of this unpaid work also takes place as volunteer and community work, but in underdeveloped rural settings, it also takes place as rural work such as fetching water and firewood, food production and processing for self-consumption. But an increasingly important component of the care economy is in paid work, in healthcare and social services, including long-term care, in education, including early childhood care, and domestic services and personal services. So as economists, we are always interested in quantifying phenomena. So a recent ILO report based on global time use data has shown that this unpaid work, the household production part of it, corresponds to an enormous amount of work, 16.5 billion hours per day, with not surprisingly, 3/4 of it performed by women. But when you think about the magnitude of this work, unpaid work, and convert it into our notion of full-time jobs, it corresponds to 2 billion full-time jobs. And that already points to the potential here for converting some of this unpaid work into paid version as a source of new jobs. The paid work comprises of 381 million workers, which is approximately 12% of global employment, and the 2/3 of it, again, are women as an extension of the gender division of labor in the household. By the way, in the region where most European countries and Turkey is located in Europe and Western Asia, the share of employment, paid care employment in total employment is quite a bit higher. It's closer to 20–25%. It's much higher than this global share. There's another way of categorizing the care work as indirect care work and direct care work. Direct care work entails the face-to-face relational care work between the caregiver and the care receiver. So it is unpaid domestic work such as bathing and feeding a baby, or a bedbound ill person, helping a child with homework, accompanying an elderly or disabled person on a doctor's visit, or it could be paid care work by care workers, such as teachers, doctors, nurses, or babysitters. Supporting this direct care work is indirect care work, which doesn't have a relational component between the caregiver and the care receiver. It entails unpaid care work such as cooking, washing, cleaning, shopping, managing house, production for self-consumption. Also, non-care workers, paid workers employed in care sectors such as administrators, cleaners, security workers, and domestic workers, who are paid care workers undertaking indirect care work in education, health, or domestic services sectors. Why is such a categorization important? It has to do really particularly with certain aspects of direct care work. So if we want to characterize that relational care work between the caregiver and the care receiver, first of all, it's quite labor intensive. And beyond that, due to the organic nature of the work, it has hard limits to increasing productivity through technology and mechanization or robotization or artificial intelligence and so on. So for instance, if it takes 30 minutes every evening to read a child a story before she goes to bed at bedtime, and if we think that this is an important component of early childhood, a care service that's an important component of early childhood development, then it would be very hard thinking of a technology or a mechanization, robotization process through which we could have the same service of reading that bedtime story produced in 5 minutes rather than 30 minutes, okay? So it's labor intensive, and there are limits to increasing productivity through technology and mechanization, and also through economies of scale. So once again, this characteristic of direct care work points to the potential for generating new jobs, paid jobs, in an age of structural transformation, technological transformation, where it seems that the whole world is worried about what is going to happen in the near future when we have a whole bunch of jobs destroyed. And this feminist work actually is pointing to this area as an important source of job creation. At the same time, however, to what extent do we want the unpaid care work to be all transformed into paid care work? Well, we don't want it in entirety.
We cannot hear you.
Yeah, Ipek, there's some problem with the sound.
Oh,
Now we can hear you, yes.
can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I hope I didn't lose too much of
No.
translation.
Please go on. Yeah.
Okay. So a substantial share of direct care work, unlike indirect care work, which we can imagine commodification almost close to 100%. In the case of direct care work, we would like some of it to be actually kept within the household as a form of solidarity between people, between household members, as a form of solidarity between community members, and resist the tendency to entire commodification. Hence, therefore, if this is a kind of society that we imagine where some care work will be done in the private sphere on an unpaid basis, we would need for policy intervention to regulate within the household for equal distribution between people, particularly between men and women. So that points to another area of policy intervention. And finally, this direct care work has characteristics of a public good or a merit good, as we call in economics, because its production, its presence or lack is subject to strong externalities, and it is underprovided by markets because there is in fact limited potential for capturing profits, given that it is very difficult to increase productivity and it is difficult to commodify entirely. Hence, again, another justification for public intervention. Now, when I started on defining what we mean by the care economy, I said in a narrow definition, because there are also extended definitions of what is meant by care economy or caring labor, where in this extended definition, care is conceptualized as something that goes beyond individual or household care to also entail care for overall community well-being nature and ecological well-being, and well-being of all living species. So in that sense, the care economy also entails production through unpaid and volunteer work in family, friends, and community. There is a feminist political scientist, John Tronto, who has this concept of caring democracy, which is the corresponding concept as of caring economies, where she calls care as everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. And that world includes not only our bodies, ourselves, but also our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex and life-sustaining web. So in that sense, it's a much more encompassing definition of what we mean by care and care work. And John Tronto also talks about how the current system, which is based on the profit motive, encourages self-centeredness, greediness, and thoughtlessness, which she emphasizes it's all under the guise of being independent and autonomous. And she talks about how we care now misunderstands freedom as choice, regardless of domination, and perpetuates inequality and makes it impossible to raise questions of care as issues of justice. So as an extension of looking at the issue in an issue of care in such a encompassing definition and in terms of its macro implications, a number of feminist economists have also talked about a crisis of care. One of the first to write about this, Susan Himmelwhite, a feminist economist from the UK, talks about how this is this threatening issue of the crisis of care is an urgent question of political will and power. And she describes this crisis as people becoming increasingly less willing and also less able to fulfill caring norms, and caring norms being eroded through time. And the reason for that being because in the current system, those who assume caring responsibilities, despite all the competitive market pressures, end up paying a higher price for doing so, end up getting the care penalty, as we all know, as women. And she warns that not to adopt a generous strategy for caring now actually threatens to erode the caring norms and make it more difficult to adopt a more caring strategy in the future, and that without such a strategy, standards and availability of care will fall, and with a high cost to the society as a whole, and in particular to those, particularly to women who continue to care. So building on that, then, if we want to summarize the reasons for why we need to start urgently caring about caring labor as an economic and social policy issue, the first reason is that just as we've seen in the billions of hours of care work and millions of care workers, care work has crucial economic functions and constitutes massive hours of work. So it does not make sense that with such huge production function, it is left out of economic and social policymaking, and it remains invisible in and it doesn't get to be a priority in economic policies. The second reason, as we all know, and probably it is the most focused on aspect when we look at the literature and the debates on care work, because imbalances in the care economy in this gender distribution of care work constitute a systematic root of persistent gender inequalities. So the gender employment gap, the gender wage gap, the gender gaps in decision-making, gender gaps in politics, the gender job segregation, actually, eventually are all outgrowth of the imbalanced distribution of 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week. The gender distribution of the most limited resource that we have, time, between paid and unpaid work, determines who has possibilities in the market sphere, who has access to income, who has access to decision-making, and so on. The third reason is...
Ipek, you have 10 minutes more.
Okay. These imbalances in the care economy also generate systematic inequalities, not only by gender, but also by class and origin, and probably international migration of care workers is a typical example of these intersectional inequalities through the imbalanced distribution of care work. Fourth, as we've just talked about, ignoring caring labor in economic and social policy threatens an emerging crisis of care. And part of it, actually, we've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, the years of accumulated underinvestment in healthcare and also in education systems ended up causing the pandemic, the communities becoming much less resilient vis-a-vis the pandemic. A fifth reason, ignoring care economy actually results in false assessments of economic and social indicators, how successful are, for instance, austerity policies are in reinstating growth, and therefore they result in ineffective policy and program interventions. And finally, on a positive tone, acknowledging the care economy unveils its potential for inclusive growth. So actually, it opens up the possibilities for policy making to focus on an area with multiplier effects, as I've just shown. So how then do we establish a purple economy? The main organizing principle is the well-known 3R strategy: recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work, which has been also more recently expanded to the 5R: reward care workers and ensure representation of care workers. And the model rests on 4 pillars. The first one is the building of a universal social care infrastructure, and the choice of the word infrastructure is with intention, because an infrastructure such as a transport, energy, or communications infrastructure is something that helps the economy to function better. And once you invest that infrastructure, it makes the economy more productive and sustainable. So in a similar sense, actually investing in care infrastructure is something that increases at the macro level the sustainability, the resilience, and the productivity of an economy. So by that, we mean accessible and quality healthcare services, education services, including early childhood development and preschool education, care services, long-term care services for elderly, disabled, and long-term ill. And this is the source of where the purple jobs are going to come from. And there's a lot of new services waiting to be innovated, for instance, such as active living day centers for elderly and disabled, beyond childcare centers. The second pillar is labor market regulation for work-life balance with equal gender incentives. So rather than the current focus on giving women part-time work, enabling women to work from home, giving women maternity leave, and focusing all these work-life balance incentives only on women, the idea here is establishing through labor market population regulation, dual learner, dual carer families, through care leave also for fathers and for men, flexible work also for male workers with care responsibilities, shorter work weeks, enabling men and women to better reconcile care needs with paid work responsibilities,
and also regulation of the labor market, given that past dependency of gender discrimination, regulating the labor market for elimination of gender discrimination, and also improving the conditions of care workers. The third component has to do with less developed rural settings, where, as I've talked about when we categorize care work as indirect and direct care work, a lot of that indirect care work in underdeveloped rural settings actually entails carrying of water, of firewood, processing food production, etc. So improvements in rural water, energy, transport infrastructure in order to reduce indirect care work and green investments in sustainable agriculture with a focus on women's reproductive and productive roles. And finally, in order to make sure that we have enough resources and a macroeconomic environment that enables the first three, a macroeconomic, a purple macroeconomic policy framework, which has decent jobs generation as its primary objective, building of inclusive, sustainable, and resilient economies. And I'm not saying necessarily growth, but building, maybe because the objective can also, in certain contexts, can also accommodate degrowth, but building inclusive, sustainable, and resilient economies as the priority objective of fiscal, monetary, and industrial sectoral policies, and growth as only one of the tools when necessary to achieve these objectives. Some of the work on the purple economy talks about the complementarities with the green economy, where the green economy arose as a response to the ecological crisis. The purple economy is actually arose as a response to the crisis of care. And, but at the same time, both models or visions also have the potential to provide an answer to the economic crisis through generation of green jobs and purple jobs. And both models actually acknowledge that human well-being depends beyond consumption of commodities on healthy ecosystems, as in the case of the green economy, and on access to quality care. And therefore, both economic visions bring something that is for most part invisible in economic research and policy discussions into the forefront, the value of nature and the value of unpaid care work. And they suggest a solution through and I think somebody unmuted. Okay, environmental costs and the costs of carrying labor into production and consumption patterns. They both aim at elimination of inequalities, and they call for a reordering of priorities from consumption to nature and nurture, from GDP growth to sustainable and equitable growth, or even degrowth. Why a purple economy in the pandemic era? The pandemic exposed the weaknesses of the paid care systems and the underlying underinvestment in so many of the countries. And simultaneously, when the paid systems and the market economy collapsed, it led also to an unprecedented increase in demand for household production, for unpaid care work, which, as we know from recent research, posed a threat to deepening gender inequalities, but at the same time, an opportunity for both men and also men and women of higher income groups to understand the importance of this unpaid care work and to appreciate and therefore develop an openness to care policies. And at the same time, the pandemic coming on top of a lingering global economic crisis triggered again a deepening economic crisis with shocks both on the supply and the demand side, and therefore there is a need for jobs generation more than ever. So purple economy as a response to the care crisis, and the economic crisis, the multiple crises that Rector Kουλούρη mentioned in her statement, while also supporting the green economy, because the purple economy, which envisions a local care services-led growth model based on generation of purple jobs, which are also low carbon emissions jobs. Therefore, they are very much in line also with green jobs and green economy priorities, this type of a local care services-led growth model. And finally, I will leave you with references to two films or series. One of them is called The Handmaid's Tale, which is based on the feminist author Margaret Atwood's book by the same name. The Handmaid's Tale, for those of you who might have seen it, is based on a dystopia in the United States, a future scenario where women are exclusively resigned to their caretaking role on an unpaid basis within the household, and where the reproduction of future generations of human beings becomes the priority of the entire system. The whole system is organized around it, but it is a very caring community, but definitely not a gender egalitarian one. So this is on one end of the spectrum. And the other one is based on two films by the Wachowskis. Their most well-known film is The Matrix, which are debatably, again, a futuristic film, a dystopia, debatably gender equal, but definitely not caring. I call them what a non-purple economic future may look like. For those of you who've seen it, the Matrix envisions human beings being born and brought up in factories, in a factory setting, rather than being born into mothers' wombs and being brought up in a household, private family setting. All of the care work is mechanized, including direct care work. And in their more recent film, in the Cloud Atlas, again, the factory production of human beings, the idea persists, but this time it is reserved, this factory production of human beings is reserved only for low-skill service workers who actually feed on food supplements produced from their fellow workers who are exterminated at the date of expiry. An economy which doesn't seem to have much gender discrimination, but definitely not the type of society as we know it, not a caring one, not one in solidarity. Okay, so let me stop there and stop sharing.
Thank you, Ipek. It was very stimulating and thought-provoking, and we have all captured your message, your final message, which is that we need to have both a gender equalitarian and a caring economy, a new economic order. Thank you very much. Τώρα θα ήθελα να σας εξηγήσω τη διαδικασία. Έχουμε κάποιο χρόνο που θα είναι διαθέσιμη η διερμηνέας μας για να μεταφράσει ερωτήσεις από τα ελληνικά στα αγγλικά και να δοθούν οι απαντήσεις από την Ipek. Προς το παρόν έχουμε ζητήσει να είναι στο chat οι ερωτήσεις και να είναι στα αγγλικά ή στα ελληνικά και να τα μεταφράσω εγώ, αλλά μπορούμε τώρα να συντομεύσουμε και να ξεκινήσουμε με τις ερωτήσεις. Ύστερα από 10 λεπτά δεν θα υπάρχει αυτή η δυνατότητα και θα πρέπει να μεταφράζω εγώ και τις ερωτήσεις στα αγγλικά και τις απαντήσεις από τα αγγλικά στα ελληνικά. Άρα λοιπόν ξεκινάμε με τις ερωτήσεις που είναι ήδη στα αγγλικά. Να ξεκινήσω από το σχόλιο της Αθηνάς της Αθανασίου. Δεν ξέρω αν θα ήταν καλύτερο Αθηνά να πάρεις το λόγο και μπορείς να ανοίξεις το μικρόφωνο σου, γιατί θα είναι πολύ πιο δύσκολο για μένα να διαβάσω, παρά από εσένα να απευθύνεις τις ερωτήσεις σου στην Ipek κατευθείαν. Θέλεις να ανοίξεις την κάμερα και να πάρεις το λόγο? Ευχαριστώ.
Ναι, βέβαια. I just try to make it easier for the speaker, so that's why I use the chat. But thank you so much for this very thought-provoking and interesting, actually, lecture. I just wanted to make a very general point on the political vocabulary of care. I'm just reading my comment here. I think the question actually is somehow answered by the undertones of your lecture, but I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about that, because I think that's really the central point of your talk. So to what extent can the care framework be mobilized as a simultaneous critique to both the uncaring global neoliberal economy and at the same time conventional family structures, including the stereotypical definition of women as natural agents of reproduction and caregiving? So to what extent this critique can be really intersectional? How can it address the multi-layered nature of it? Also, I think your lecture has aptly made clear that one of the powers of the care framework lies precisely in the potential to address intersectional inequalities. So how does the care framework work to combat such intersectional injustices related to gender, class, race, ethnicity, and migrant status, especially taking into account that in Europe today, care is often carried out by women migrant workers coming from the global South, Eastern Europe? And finally, I just wanted to thank you for the very suitable references at the epilogue of your talk, especially the Margaret Atwood reference. I think it's a very, very suitable literary reference. Thank you so much for your very, very valuable contribution today.
Ipek?
Shall I answer?
Yes, please,
okay.
because
right.
we won't have the interpreter after this.
Yeah, okay. Yes, thank you for these very appropriate and interesting questions. In fact, I think it's a very good observation that what this model, the purple economy, the caring economy idea is situated as a juxtaposition to neoliberalism on one hand. And when you mentioned that, one of the first things that came into my mind was the discussions that we had with representatives from the World Bank and the IMF, who were very keen. I think it was in the earlier part of the 2010s to use this empirical work looking at how if women are to increase their employment levels and employment hours to the same extent as men, the world GDP would grow by so much percentage. And they did it on a global scale. Actually, it was done by a private consulting company, McKinsey, but it was very much within the sport of the Washington consensus institutions. And then they did numerous versions of it on a country basis. And every time I heard this example being used to justify economic policymakers to intervene, to increase women's employment levels, to increase women's employment hours, I and my feminist colleagues, we felt that we were obliged to intervene and say, hey, all these policy simulations are assuming that women have infinite time, right? How are they supposed to, if they put the same amount of energy and hours into the market economy, who's gonna do all that unpaid work? What are you doing with 16.5 billion hours of care work on a daily basis? So this is a false simulation on false assumptions where you take your main reference point, your only economic world is the market, and your only reference point is GDP growth. So this is where I think, the gender equality advocacy from a neoliberal perspective is such a narrow one, that justifies basically gender equality economic policies for the sake of GDP growth, and the only envisioning is women replicating male patterns of economic behavior without any consideration about what's going to. So this is what's going to lead us to the matrix type human factory, gender egalitarian but not caring economies. But on the other hand, what we have increasingly in a global context where we see authoritarianism, a crisis of democracy, which inevitably goes hand in hand with traditional family policies, right? Conventional promoting policies to promote conventional family structures, is the idea that assuming that the market economy will function as it is in a competitive manner without regulation, and then women should be allowed to participate only to the extent where they can reconcile these dual roles. And so it is what I call a 1.5 earner model, with the men working full-time and the woman working part-time. And this is considered, and then, there's this cosmetic increase in female employment rates through such part-time and marginal employment patterns. And this is thought to be good enough in the way of gender equality. But what we're seeing in advanced capitalist countries, such as South Korea, for instance, that there is a triple crisis of, a demographic crisis. Well, we need to discuss from a feminist perspective what is meant by a demographic crisis, because it takes a nation state as its reference point. But at the same time, an aging society with an elderly care crisis. And women are basically increasing that the younger generation is refusing to be the caretakers in an economy where labor market full-time job hours are over 50 hours. And the only way to stay in the market is if you stop to care altogether. Yeah, so that's what I mean by a third way exit, like avoiding those two scenarios and taking the third exit out.
Thank you, Ipek. Θα δώσω το λόγο στην Δήμητρα Γκασούκα που σήκωσε το χέρι της. Δήμητρα, έχεις το λόγο.
Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ και συγγνώμη, αλλά λόγω κάποιες δυσκολίες στα χέρια δεν μπορώ να τοποθετηθώ. Μπορείτε
να μιλήσετε στα αγγλικά ή θα μιλήσετε στα αγγλικά? Ναι. Έχουμε δυνατότητα ακόμα, νομίζω.
Okay. Λοιπόν, my name is Dimitra Gasuka and I'm a social worker. I'm a disabled woman, and I heard your speech and it was really amazing. I would like to make some comments regarding your speech in comparison with Ναι, εντάξει, okay. Απλά προσπαθώ να συντονιστώ μαζί σας γι' αυτό. Λοιπόν, σχετικά με την τοποθέτηση της, ήθελα να πω ότι ακούσα κάποια πράγματα τα οποία αφορούν στη φροντίδα. Θα κάνω κάποιες ερωτήσεις, τοποθετήσεις, προκειμένου να δούμε με τις απαντήσεις που αναμένω, κατά πόσον έχουν συμπεριληφθεί οι ανάπηρες γυναίκες μέσα στην ΜΟΒ οικονομία. Πρώτα απ' όλα, θυμάμαι ότι, από όσο έχω διαβάσει τουλάχιστον, ότι τα ιδρύματα που δημιουργηθήκαν στην αρχή της βιομηχανικής επανάστασης δημιουργηθήκαν ακριβώς για τον λόγο του να βγουν οι γυναίκες από τα σπίτια να εργαστούν, λόγω των δυσκολιών των οικονομικών που είχαν ξεκινήσει στις οικογένειες. Περάσαμε από την αγροτική στην βιομηχανική επανάσταση. Αυτό είχε λοιπόν σαν αποτέλεσμα τα ιδρύματα, την δημιουργία ιδρυμάτων, τόσο για τους ηλικιωμένους όσο και για τα ανάπηρα άτομα. Τώρα βρισκόμαστε μετά από τόσα χρόνια που συνεχίζουν το αίτημα των αναπήρων για την αποϊδρυματοποίηση δεν έχει γίνει πραγματικότητα. Μιλάμε λοιπόν για μια μοβ οικονομία, η οποία μοβ οικονομία θα έχει πάλι σαν επίκεντρο τη φροντίδα των ανάπηρων ανθρώπων και τη φροντίδα των ανάπηρων ανθρώπων. Κάτι το οποίο είναι κόντρα με αυτό που πιστεύει το αναπηρικό κίνημα και αγωνίζεται γι' αυτό. Πώς θα μπορούσε να συμπεριληφθεί λοιπόν το θέμα αυτό που είναι πολύ σοβαρό, γιατί έρχεται κόντρα με τα δικαιώματα των αναπήρων και των γυναικών, αλλά και των ανδρών και φυσικά και τα ανάπηρα παιδιά. Αυτό ήταν το ένα. Ήθελα να μιλήσω, να πω απλά για τον προσωπικό βοηθό, που είναι ένας θεσμός, ο οποίος αναπτύσσεται πάρα πολύ στα ευρωπαϊκά κράτη, στη χώρα μας, προσωπικού βοηθού, personal assistant. Λοιπόν, για να δούμε και αυτό κατά πόσο μπορεί να συμπεριληφθεί, γιατί παρουσιάζεται το αίτημα των γονιών να γίνουν προσωπικοί βοηθοί στα παιδιά τους. Στα παιδιά που έχουν κάποια αναπηρία, κάποια βλάβη. Αυτό, εξώ από... Ναι, συγγνώμη.
Ναι, λίγο να συντομεύετε για να...
Βεβαίως. Απλά είναι ερωτήσεις που νομίζω...
Ναι, φυσικά.
Συγγνώμη, θα είμαι πολύ πιο σύντομη. Αυτό λοιπόν πώς θα μπορούσε, όταν μιλάμε για ανεξαρτησία των ανάπηρων παιδιών και πληρώνονται οι γονείς τους για να τους φροντίζουν, πώς αυτό θα γίνει. Και κάτι τελευταίο είναι πώς αν έχουν συμπεριληφθεί οι ανάπηρες γυναίκες που ζουν στα σπίτια τους και δουλεύουν στις οικογενειακές επιχειρήσεις ή οτιδήποτε άλλο τέτοιο, μαύρη εργασία, και οι ανάπηρες γυναίκες οι οποίες χρειάζονται βοηθό για να εργαστούν. Έχουμε εδώ πέρα δηλαδή μια γυναίκα φροντίζει μια άλλη γυναίκα για να εργαστεί. Αυτά, ευχαριστώ πολύ και συγγνώμη αν πήρα παραπάνω χρόνο.
Ipek.
Thank you, Dimitra. I think you touched upon a very important sub-topic that the purple economy area entails. And I think, if you remember, when I first started talking about the 3 points of emphasis, one of them was the 2 guiding principles, the simultaneous integration of the perspectives and the rights of caregivers as well as care receivers, right? And I think that creates an important entry point in terms of enabling higher quality care that disabled people need, the support that they need, but at the same time enabling them to give care and also to participate in the public sphere through that sport. So I think that's a entry point from the purple economy conceptualization into looking at the different groups. There's also those who are in need of long-term care because they're ill and bedbound, but there are also disabled people who are highly functional in many respects, but need some support and so on. And one of the things that we started promoting in the Turkish context is active living centers, as we call them, for various groups such as the elderly and also for different groups of disabled people, citizens, where people can go and where they can receive services at a center, at a local center on a daily basis, and where they can socialize, where they can find even employment opportunities and so on. So this was because for a long time, our slogan was that we want a childcare center in each neighborhood. Now we expanded that slogan, childcare center and active living centers in each neighborhood, responding to the different needs. And with respect to the personal assistant, the family, if I understood it correctly,
family members opting to become personal assistant to disabled children. I'm not sure if I got it right through the translation. I think the system really needs to provide a choice to people, whether they want some combination of a professional assistant, such as, for instance, for children with learning disabilities, the system of shadow teachers actually works really well, but they're very short in supply. And despite the fact that many countries in Europe legislate for it, when it comes to reality and to implementation, it is not provided for. But in an ideal world, in an ideal caring economy, in a caring society, in solidarity, actually families with disabled children should have the choice of, themselves having the possibility to become the shadow teachers or the personal assistants, in addition to using some professional services. And I think we would all agree that both as caregivers and care receivers, the best model is a combination model, is a hybrid model, where we would like to benefit from the care of our families, of our friends, unpaid care, but at the same time, we would like to have the option of accessing paid professional care support in other respects. So the combination model, I think, probably is the best model for both parties.
Thank you, Ipek. There is another question. We don't have the interpreter anymore with us, and I will just read the question in English on the chat by Mr. Dragatis. The purple economy is in addition to a social democratic or a green economy, or could it be developed as a different holistic counter proposal of a new economy? This is the question.
Yeah, well, that's a good and challenging question. I see it as something that's complementary to a social democratic and a green economy, where I think the green economy by itself, or a social democratic economy by itself, without the emphasis on the purple objectives, would be ineffective over the long run. So similar to a purple economy, that it entails the green and the social democratic components, but at the same time, it would benefit from the additional emphasis points that those other models entail. And in fact, my colleague Özlem Onaran, who is a macroeconomist at the University of Greenwich, she has been working on some macro modeling. I'm doing applied empirical work, and she's doing more theoretical macro modeling work. She's taken this idea of the purple economy and she's put it in some of her what she calls post-Keynesian feminist demand-side macroeconomic models to look at the impact of purple investments in care on growth, productivity, and wages, and so on. And she's developed it. Now she's undertaking a new line of work, which she calls macroeconomic modeling for a purple, green, and red economy. And the red aspect refers to what maybe what was the name? Mr. Dragatis calls a social democratic economy, where they are simulating with purple investments, green investments, in addition to increasing of the minimum wage, for instance, and reduction to a shorter work week. So improvements of the labor market for better, decent job conditions and for an increasing wage share.
So this means, let me go further on. So this means that the purple economy could be combined with other proposals for transformation of the society and of the economy. So it can be combined. It does not go only towards a social democratic, but also other directions and options.
Yes,
for change, for social change. No?
Yes.
Is it correct or not?
It's very correct. I mean, let me give an example. For instance, one of the long-standing demands of labor unions have been a family wage, right? And that idea of a family wage is based on single male breadwinner, along with a female full-time caretaker, homemaker, with some other dependent children in the household. So the idea is, that wage negotiations should be made assuming a single wage earner in the family. Well, when you add the purple economy ideas to it, actually the type of family that we're talking about is if it's a dual earner, dual carer family, then the demand goes beyond the family wage. It goes to entail how decent living conditions should be enabled through two wages coming into the family without any income poverty, but also with decent consumption possibilities, but also without any time poverty, so that both people, both the dual earners, are able to also undertake their care responsibilities in an equal manner. So a shorter working week and access to quality care services would come along with the request for decent wages.
Thank you. Vula and Areti, are there other questions perhaps on the YouTube? Can you pass on the questions that may have appeared on the YouTube, because I don't have any access to YouTube. Areti?
There are no questions on YouTube right now.
Yeah.
There has been a comment though.
Okay. Okay, I can read it. Okay. There is a comment, Ipek, that has been passed over from YouTube. You may read it. Very interesting contribution. Thank you. It is not entirely clear to me the distinction between direct and indirect care work. It may be clear perhaps at the macro level, but at the micro level, the boundaries between direct and indirect care work are not always distinct. For example, daily care provision involves activities akin to housework to facilitate the care provided as meticulous cleaning, preparation of special needs, etc., special meals, etc. Then the provision of care by meeting financial needs, coordinating professionals involved in meeting the needs of the person receiving care, participating in specialized treatments in association to promote quality care issues, accompanying to medical services, and so on. So I've understood that there is some.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I would like to say, Maria, is that inevitably the direct and the indirect care work goes hand in hand, right? You do the food shopping, you prepare the meal, and then you feed the ill-bound, the bed-bound ill person. You wash you do the laundry, and then you dress a baby in clean clothes, and you put her to sleep in clean clothes, and so on. So inevitably, all this work goes ahead in a continuum. But from an economic perspective, when we make that distinction, and I'm not the first one to make that distinction, by the way, it has been made by other feminist social scientists, economists before me. But what my take on it is that it is the indirect care work part that has more potential for becoming more efficient, increasing productivity through mechanization, such as, like vacuum cleaners and dishwashers and laundry machines and so on, where technological progress has already done it. But I think there's a lot more space for increasing the number of hours involved in indirect care work through technological progress,
mechanization, and also through commodification, as compared to direct care work. The direct care work, that relational one-to-one, the example that I gave of reading a story to a child before bedtime, or accompanying an elderly person to the park on her daily walk. These are the types of things that it's not possible to shorten the time. It is time intensive, which means it's labor intensive. And to the extent that it's labor intensive, when you convert it from unpaid form into paid form, it generates a lot of new jobs. This is why the care services sector has a very high employment multiplier. So what the point is to emphasize that direct component, that direct care, therefore entails all this potential to be converted into the public sphere, into paid jobs, and become a leading sector in job creation. Only if policymakers would start seeing that work being held, and at the same time improve the quality of life for the care receivers, because if it's done with high quality professional labor, the quality of care is likely to increase as well. But at the same time, what I was trying to say is that we don't want all of it commodified for the type of communities, societies that we want to live in. So we don't want very high quality childcare centers being set up and giving services 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We don't give birth to children so that we can leave them in the care of paid professional workers for their lifetime and then see them, just go back to see them when they become an adult. This is the idea. And if part of that direct care work is going to stay within the private sphere, in the household, then the next policy question becomes, beyond provisioning of paid care services, what does the policymaker need to do? What we need to do is also intervene through regulatory policies to make sure that men are also incentivized and mandated to take their part of unpaid care work, the direct care work.
So there is a value system behind the purple economy as well, no?
Yeah.
So about care, about gender equality, it's taken for granted from a feminist perspective, but regarding care and the ideal of care, it's also, there is also a value system behind that. We don't want everything to be commodified or externalized either to the market or to the state.
Yes.
We should, for the human relations to flourish, we need to have the personal relationship with as caregivers or care receivers.
Exactly. And this is, I mean, we already have a lot of unpaid care work going on within the household as we see it. So in that sense, we are living in caring societies to a large part, but we are sick and tired of women being the gatekeepers. So that's the point. We want caring societies where men also come up to the front and start taking on their equal role as gatekeepers. So we want men as gatekeepers of caring societies as well.
And at the same time, from what I deduce from what you have already exposed, that we also, if we are also doing care because we are obliged to, we are providing care because we are obliged to. Whereas if care, the need for care was reduced in terms of time, this would be more.
It could be even a consumption activity.
Yeah, it could be a pleasure and not an obligation. A pleasure of just and quality of human relationships, and exactly. Not an obligation that is many times mixed, and we cannot.
And to the extent that and to the extent that it becomes it is imposed only on particular people, all that caring time, and to the extent that the caregivers, then women,
mothers of small children, etc., become exhausted and start resenting it, the quality of care also transforms. So it also becomes undesirable from the perspective of the care receiver. So it, in a way, that gender distribution impinges not on the principle of co-responsibility in caregiving, but also in equality in care receiving. And that's very much determined by purchasing power and socioeconomic lines as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me take another question, perhaps the final one. I'm not sure, but I think it's the final one. How does purple economy deal with the problem of the gender segregation of professions in the care sector? 80% of the workforce are women. Won't we fall in the same vicious circle of a system that women get to serve the needs for household responsibilities of other women?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get that a lot, actually, particularly when I present my empirical work on investing in care and how it creates a lot of new jobs for women, particularly to transfer to the paid care sectors. But what we see in our empirical work, this futuristic policy simulations, is the following, particularly for the work that we did for the ILO, which entailed 45 countries. It was all the OECD countries plus a number of developing countries. It included also China and India. What we saw, and the simulation was done into 2030, which is the target date for the Sustainable Development Goals. So what the simulation did was the following. What if the governments from 2015 into 2030 increase their public spending on expansion of healthcare and education services, including long-term care services and also including childcare and preschool education services, in line with the SDGs? What would happen to the job generation and their gender distribution? You know what we saw? Because if you expand the care sector to such a degree, when it starts becoming about 25% to 30% of total employment, then inevitably the simulation starts picking up on men, unemployed men, and men excluded from the labor market. So the care sector inevitably starts becoming more gender balanced. So actually expanding paid care sector in a way is a way of improving the gender balance. But at the same time, I think it needs to be helped with other policy action, such as promoting care jobs, not only for women, but also as male jobs, similar to what we are demanding for jobs in the digital economy or in high-tech sectors, etc., being, not being only exclusive male domains. So I think that sort of socialization of men and women into a more diverse job selection needs to go both ways. I mean, for the time being, it's only going, about women being promoted to exclusively male sectors, but we don't see the reverse. So I think the reverse kind of socialization needs to happen with promoting of men into care sectors.
Okay, thank you very much, Ipek. I cannot see any other question on the chat. Neither some question transferred from the YouTube. So I think that we have come to the end of this event, and I wish to thank everybody for being with us, and especially Ipek Ilkkarakan. It was a great honor for us, Ipek, and it was a great pleasure and honor for our rectoress to be with us as well this evening, and I hope that everybody enjoyed this event, and we are coming we are coming soon with the community, Pantheon community, together in our next event, which is going to take place on the 8th of April. And we are going to present our new guide on facing gender-based violence and sexual harassment at Pantheon University. So you're welcome to our next event, and you are going to receive a call and invitation to join us, not through live, in a live event at Pantheon at the great amphitheater of Sakis Karaginas. So it was a pleasure being with Ipek, and I hope that we are going to see each other soon on the ground.
I hope so too.
Okay.
Athens or Istanbul. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you. Thank you.